This is in response to Dr. Paul Krugman's article in the New York Times on Friday, October 23rd, 2015. I'm just going to label it as Liberals Win Big in Canada. Now, for the last 10 years, the government has been run by their social conservatives, the equivalent of the Republicans. I don't even know if they're called social conservatives. They've run on an austerity plan, and they didn't think that the Liberals could do this, but the Liberals won big in Canada. It was a complete rejection of the austerity measures that Canada has been going through for the last 10 years. And what Dr. Krugman points out very aptly is that Canada has been ahead of the curve for quite some time. It's because, this was a rejection of all of the austerity measures that have been going on in Canada, have been going on in America, have been going on in Western Europe. A complete rejection. And they basically embraced the concept of the Keynesian philosophy of that when you are in an economic downturn and interest rates are very low, that is the best time to invest. That's when deficit spending should not matter because you need to invest in your country. And Dr. Krugman points out that this is what America, this is what Europe, this is what Canada were doing. They were screaming and yelling about the deficits, about how terrible they were, and of course, what was needed to be addressed, especially after 2008 and 2009 of the Great Recession, was what needed to be addressed was high unemployment and a weak demand for goods. And this is what really drives the economy, not paying off deficits when there is high unemployment and there is very little need for goods. Now, Canada's been ahead of the curve in terms of economics on a number of matters for a number of times. In the 1950s, everyone said that Canada should peg their dollar to the American dollar, dollar for dollar, interchangeable, tied to it. And they basically said, no. And they've done pretty well with it being separate from the United States. And right now, that was a good lesson that should have been looked at a little bit more closely by some countries in Europe when they were getting browbeaten into having to join the euro. That they thought the consensus was that you couldn't have your currency outside of the euro, especially if you were living, right in the middle of Europe. And of course, now that we've seen what's happened to the euro, not to say that we have to disband it now, but there is ample evidence that not necessarily every single country had to join into the euro. Another thing was that Clinton had to do some things that he probably wouldn't have done if he had a full Democratic Congress. He went in for bank deregulation in the late 90s or the mid 90s, and it probably never should have happened. And of course, the idea was by the Republicans that by deregulating the bank systems, we would have a flurry of economic activity as freedom marched on. And of course, what we found out is that with so much deregulation, the banks basically took your money, they took my money, and instead of holding that in reserve, they used their own deposits to bet against things. And it was all good while it was good, but it didn't last and it never could last. They were against deregulation. They didn't have much bank deregulations. So when this crap happened in 2008 and 2009, in terms of Bear Stearns going down, in terms of the Lehman Brothers going down, in terms of, remember, Bush had to have an economic stimulus package. It went through right away. But when Obama came in, no, it didn't go through right away. So, and remember, Democrats voted for that stimulus package for Bush because they saw what terrible things were going to happen to the economy if we did not make a big investment in that. So what we have with the liberals, the Democratic liberals in Canada, is they see a need that deficits and interest rates do matter. and that is important when the interest rates are so low that we should be investing. And the question that Dr. Krugman says, doesn't this sound reasonable? And I would say, of course it does. This is the way we should be doing things. And of course, when the interest rates are low, they can borrow at just the prices they could never borrow at before. And this is the time to make an investment in infrastructure. Now, in the U.S., we've been clamoring for that also. Will that same type of thing, will that same scenario pop up as we go into the election season? Tonight, they're going to have the Republicans debating on economic issues. Let's just see how many of them are willing to do deficit spending, so to speak, to allow us to invest in our country to pay off our debts. We'll see how many of them do that. See how many of them agree to climate change. Well, that's another story for another day. And remember, Europe and the United States, have basically indicated that austerity is the way to go. And I would think that very soon we'll see additional investments in infrastructure in Canada, and I think that we will see the results of all being positive. Now let's remember that from, I believe it was 1945, if you want to consider 1945, around 1945 at the end of World War II, to 1973, we had a tremendous increase in the percentage of people who moved up to being middle class. And in terms of average wages have not really gone up for the average person since the mid-70s. And I'm not blaming Carter for this at all, but it took a dramatic turn downward and it's continued to spiral downward once Reagan came in. And the question is, will the liberal Democrats in the United States follow their sisters and brothers in Canada and help us move forward?